Now we can officially start. So I'm Jen Sis, Executive Director at the Strafford Regional Planning Commission. Happy to have you here with us this afternoon. We are here to talk about housing, but not just housing alone, housing and natural resource protection, and how we can be working to achieve both simultaneously and acknowledge that one does not have to come at the expense of the other. As part of this effort, we are funded through a grant from our partner or sister agency across the river, the Southern Maine Planning and Development Council. We have been working alongside them on a project for the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And if you can imagine, what does the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard have to do with the Strafford region? Much of the New Hampshire-based commuters to the shipyard live in our region. And one of the biggest challenges that they are having at the shipyard is not only traffic and transportation, getting in and out of the base, but also finding housing that is affordable and proximate to the base. So through the Southern Maine Planning and Development Council, they have gone and received a grant from Department of Defense. And we think, planning, why do we have grants from the Department of Defense? But they operate a joint land use study fund for the different bases across the country so that they can look at and tackle different land use issues that they are having. And so here we are today, trying to work on the implementation phase of a prior joint land use study. So we, along with Southern Maine Planning and Development Council and the Rockingham Planning Commission, are doing a few different things collaboratively. We've each been starting to develop a series of briefs on some of the best practices that we have seen in the last few years. We are each hosting one webinar and one in-person workshop. We'll be holding our in-person workshop in September. And then over the course of this summer, we'll have some funding to work with municipalities in the region to address some housing challenges. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Blair, Principal Planner here at SRPC, who's going to be our moderator and host today. So with that, Blair.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. As she mentioned, I'm a principal planner here with Strafford Regional Planning Commission, and I'm working on the joint land use study as part of this our RPC, but I'm also working on a few other projects and have worked on other projects that are housing related. I've worked in Somersworth and Dover. I'm currently working in Nottingham and again in Somersworth. And through that time, what we've heard, among many things with regards to housing development, is that rub that exists between homes and habitats, areas of our natural resources and our cultural resources, as well as the need for housing at this time. So we wanted to bring in a couple of people to have a discussion with us. We've posed a few questions, and we're gonna send those questions to them so that we can hear what they have to say, what their experiences are from their perspectives. So the goal for this meeting is to have a good cross-section of conversation. It's not an either-or conversation. This is a conversation. It's about an ongoing dialogue that continues to happen in all of our communities. And for those of you that are here in attendance, perhaps you can take some things that you learned today, bring them back to your community, and again, just continue that dialogue about housing, about resource protection, be they natural resources, cultural resources, that sort of thing. So the panelists here are going to be discussing their experiences from the perspective of their organization. They're here in their individual, their personal capacity, but they're here to talk about it from their organizations. and relay to us what they've experienced. So we have three panelists. I'm going to move the slide forward and hopefully that's what pops up. So this is our group. We have Emmy Ham. She is the Executive Director at the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. We have Abigail Lyon, the Community Engagement Manager at Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, PrEP. And then we have Kyle Pimental. He's the Assistant Director at SRPC. He's also the Farmington Town Planner, the contract planner for them. We feel like this is a great cross-section of what we want to talk about today. These groups can give us some high-level perspective, but also some on-the-ground perspective, which is what we're hoping for towards the end. And then, of course, we're going to open it up to questions for all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to open this up. We're asking the panelists to give us a brief introduction, give us a little bit of context of where they're coming from, to open things up, and then we'll get into the questions. So, Emmy, I've got you first if you want to get us started, please.
Thanks, Blair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmy Ham. I'm the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. And some of you might be familiar with our organization, but our mission is to educate and engage communities and municipalities to advance housing options so that everyone who works in the Greater Seacoast region can also afford to call it home. We often say that housing is where jobs go to sleep. So in that sense, members of our workforce are very vital resources in our region. So they're the people power who are, driving our economy. And our economy is really inextricably linked to climate and natural resources protection. So of course, we are thinking about those issues as well in our work, but it's great to be here.
Thanks, Emmy. Appreciate it. Next up, Abigail.
Thank you, Blair. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abigail Lyon with the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, or PrEP. Just want to share a little bit about PrEP for the opening context for today's conversation. But PrEP, hopefully folks on the call are somewhat familiar. We're a collaborative-driven local organization and a national estuary program here in New Hampshire and Southern Maine. We work with towns, with researchers, and local organizations to offer scientifically informed solutions, ultimately to improve the health of our waters. Through that, we do a lot of grant funding, process facilitation, collaborative workshop development. We talk to folks just like yourself as part of these more regional conversations and thinking really creatively about region-wide collaboration, non-regulatory approaches, and we're here to help you tackle those big water quality challenges.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Welcome. Kyle Pimental, the Assistant Director of SRPC.
Thanks, Blair. Kyle Pimental, Assistant Director. I have been with the Planning Commission. I think I just celebrated my 17th year here. A majority of my career at the Planning Commission has been in water resources planning and land use. And so, as things have changed in terms of me working with the town of Farmington, I've become a little bit more engaged with these related issues like housing and transportation, as much as I sort of drag my feet when it comes to transportation. But, recognizing how all of these different uses overlap and connect. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation and giving some perspective of how a small town like of Farmington has taken what I think is a leadership role in the region, and how a small community can make strides on this and still keep what they believe to hold as a high value of their natural resources and their rural character in parts of town.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyle. I appreciate it. So that's our group. That's what we have today, and we're very fortunate to have this group. So without further ado, I want to get into our questions and get the conversation going. The first one I'm going to send to Abigail, and I wanted to know about which natural resources do you think are under the greatest threat from new housing development, and what are you seeing out there that will help color this picture?
Sure. Thanks, Blair, for the softball or not softball question for the first one. If I could just pause for 1 second. I know I can see some of the folks who are participating and I recognize a few names, but maybe we could invite folks to just enter their name and the community that they're representing in the chat. I know there's some maybe not new faces, but new names in that participant list. That'll help give me a little context too, just in terms of the natural resource component of the conversation. So maybe while folks do that, I can start to answer the question. So Blair and the SRPC team or Strafford Regional Planning Commission team had asked me, what of those natural resources that we have are most at risk in terms of development or most impacted. And really, it's kind of a complicated answer. PREP is a watershed-based organization. We look at the health of our estuaries, both the Hampton-Seabrook Estuary and Great Bay Estuary here in our region, and also all the tributaries or those rivers that feed into those systems. And the short answer is that really everything has some impact or sees some impact with development. There's not one particular resource or one flora or fauna, whether it's a plant or an animal, that sees the most impact. What we're really looking at or tracking across our communities is what is the role of development on increasing pressures to these sensitive systems. So whether that's erosion control, looking at things like total suspended solids entering our water bodies, making them cloudier, which can be really challenging for both the fish that live in those systems, the plants that grow in those systems that provide habitat. We also look at nutrients, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which can travel across a hardened landscape into our water bodies. And also looking at things like septic systems. So some of the infrastructure that's associated with housing. The short story of this is that although there is impact, there's ways for us to mitigate or to maybe change course or alleviate some of the impact in some cases. And a lot of that is done through things like land use regulations in a community, looking at things like stormwater management, but also, and really relevant to the conversation today, is siting of new development and different types of development. So we can sort of think about what resources we don't want to impact as heavily, and where there might be places that we could incentivize development or maybe better suited for that use in a community.
Great, thank you. For the format today, we're going to be allowing the other panelists to jump in. A lot of the questions are pointed to a particular one, but if there's anybody that wants to add anything, feel free to. Yeah, it wasn't an easy question for sure to get us started. Everything's got a stake in the game, it does gives us some context as we're talking about housing and development that is going to occur, and what we can start to think about as we look down the road.
Blair, one thing I'll add to that, because I think Abigail outlined a lot of what the development pressures on natural resources, but one other that I have at least heard on a larger scale that just goes beyond our region, but it's just more of a larger trend, is the sale of active farms. We don't have a ton of them anymore, but the ones that we do have been traditionally in families for generations, and newer generations are not necessarily taking up what their parents, grandparents, those traditions are going away in many cases, and that those lands are being sold off and subdivided. Sometimes these active farms are on prime soils, or if they've lasted this long, then, typically you've got a decent yield for crops. And so I think that's another one as part of discussion. It doesn't necessarily get to sort of a housing issue necessarily, but it is a loss of resources, that we have come to know in this part of the country of, there are active farms. It's not anywhere near what it was, but I think that's also sort of a part of the discussion is, are there things that could incentivize folks to keep those, put them into conservation? There's probably a larger discussion that needs to be had about the rules in which those farms can be used. And allowing flexibility for agritourism and other things to be, allowed on those lots, and not sort of make it so restrictive where the farm can't economically be feasible. So, those are a couple of other things that I have heard that is a larger discussion for not just our region, but the entire state.
Yeah, Kyle, if I could jump in there too, the 2021 New Hampshire Coastal Watershed Conservation Plan, which was published by the Nature Conservancy, is one of those tools where we can think about where are their high value lands or co-occurrence of multiple values to start prioritizing conservation, knowing we can't and won't conserve all parcels of land. And one of the data sets within there is priority agricultural resources. So looking at not just active farms, but areas where soils are suitable for farming, even just to retain those and have communities be aware of where they are within their own community to help them think about where they might, prioritize conservation or prioritize development.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what was the name of the plan again?
The New Hampshire Coastal Watershed Conservation Plan.
Okay.
Folks may be familiar with Connect to Protect, which was also an effort over the last few years to do some focused outreach for that plan. And I can provide a link to that in the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah. If not, Owen may be able to grab it while he's monitoring that for us. So thank you. So the next question I wanted to pose to Emmy and to bring her into the fold here. One of the terms that we hear that people may be becoming familiar with is gentle density. Sometimes we hear incremental density. This is a term that's popped up in the last few years as we've been talking more and more about housing. I was wondering if you can give us, your thoughts on this concept of gentle density, incremental density, how it can help, and what you've seen out there to be useful in this in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. So gentle density essentially, maybe to oversimplify it, means adding homes, and we're talking accessory dwelling units, duplexes, cottage courts. You're adding those types of homes in ways that fit existing neighborhood character, feel, and values. So it's really designed to be small scaled, human scaled in a way that increases housing options for people at all income levels. So we're seeing this as a key strategy really across the Seacoast and the state of New Hampshire. It is intended to allow us to grow without sprawling, which we know is one of the biggest detriments to our climate and local natural resources. So it's a key strategy. It could also be thought of as building homes where resources already exist, including infrastructure like sewer and water, but also social resources like grocery stores, medical buildings, community centers, libraries, places of work and worship, etc. All of those really key human resources. So not only do we want to build near infrastructure, but resources, and that helps us to get people off the road, closer to jobs, closer to resources. And we can do that, through gentle density.
Yeah, thank you. It's more than just a discussion about natural resources and housing. We're talking about workforce. We're talking about people being able to afford the housing, as well as those impacts. Gentle density has sort of evolved as a technique out there that we can use. Other people know it as different framing. Infill development might be one, but it's you don't go from a rural community to an urban area overnight, and I think that's what we were seeing out there when we read about that. So the question that I wanted to pose again was about preserving our rural identity and the rural landscapes. This is a key piece to a lot of different communities. The conversation about housing and impacts to resources is not limited to rural areas. It does include urban areas as well. But we do have a lot of conversation about rural identity and landscapes and preserving it alongside of adding housing units. Abigail, how have you seen communities take this on, and what do you feel like is a good way to have that discussion within your community?
Sure. Thanks so much, Blair. So Emmy touched on a couple of these things just a moment ago, thinking about like infill development as one opportunity, or maybe adding gentler development in some areas, looking at the size of lots for properties, for example. But even taking a step, like it's so tempting to go down the path of like, what is that one tool that I use in my community, or where have I seen it elsewhere? And what I would encourage folks to do is really to take a step back and have conversations like these ones, have conversations like communities are having in Nottingham, for example, talking about natural resources, simultaneously talking about housing. So we're not pitting these things against one another. Natural resource inventories are a great first step for communities who want to get a better understanding of what resources exist in their community. I think Kyle has added a few examples in the chat. Really, for you all to take a look at what are those gems, what are those resources that you want to protect or preserve? What do you want to have access to for the public? So that way, when we're citing locations for development projects, whether they are infill or multi-use housing or cluster housing or open space, development plans, that they're being cited in appropriate locations and really driven by the vision of the community, right? We want to have as many voices in a community as possible participating, having really, deep community engagement, so that when these decisions come up, we know development will happen. We know our communities are growing, and how privileged are we to live in a place where others want to come, that we're setting them in places that we feel comfortable, being development, that have access to those resources. As Emmy mentioned, we're not building urban centers out in rural areas that aren't connected to the rest of the community. Those that have access to those public systems like infrastructure, looking at water and sewer. In some of our communities, we have natural gas systems that are available as well. Sidewalks are another big component where we want to be folding this into the character of a whole community and making folks feel like a part of a community, but really taking that step back and saying like, okay, here are maybe some opportunities where communities could incentivize development, or maybe thinking about long-range planning in terms of your master plans. Where are those places that development could go? What are those resources that you want to be more restrictive around or have additional protections, whether that's land conservation or thinking about buffers around certain resources, as another example.
Yeah, it's some good points in there. It's hard to have. There's a limited conversation sometimes when you're working in the space. You're talking about housing or you're talking about natural resources, but everything affects everything else. And we want to build vibrant communities. We want to encourage vibrant communities. But it is challenging to have that conversation if the scope is limited. But the outreach and the engagement piece is key. And the HOP grant, for example, has required us to spend a lot of time getting out to the communities and getting deeper in the communities. And I think it's been effective in a lot of the ones that I've worked on. Kyle,
I could jump in there, Blair.
yeah.
I think I don't know if you were teeing me up on purpose, but I just wanted to give a quick plug for our Design Charrette program, which really aims to do all of the things that were just discussed in terms of coming up with sometimes it's, a design for a building or, a mixed use building, housing development, whatever it might be, that really works for the community. So it's acknowledging that there's no one size fits all model, and it's really bringing community members into the folds early and often, creating those feedback loops for them so that they're right there alongside the experts who are looking at what's possible, what the constraints are, and what can really be done to accomplish the vision that's outlined in those community plans. So we've done design charrettes across the Seacoast and in southern, including southern Maine, ranging from communities like Madbury, which is a relatively small rural community, to Portsmouth, and some larger communities. So it can be done anywhere. And if your community is really struggling with how to approach that problem, that is exactly what this kind of thing is intended for. So
That's great to
happy
hear.
to share resources.
Please do. Yeah, if there's a link, throw it in the chat to get it to everybody. As you mentioned, Kyle has added a few items in there as well. I'm going to send the next one his way. It's a bit of a spinoff on that one. When people are looking for resources, they're looking for places they can go to grab some information and learn a little bit more. The New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, I keep calling it a toolkit. It's a toolbox, but it was put together by the state, and it has a lot of different styles of housing. So often you hear the conversation, it's either density or nothing, right? But there's a lot of different types of housing that have evolved over the years that people are more familiar with, or that are, kind of newish on the scene. Kyle, can you talk to us a little bit about the toolbox and relate it back to some of the things we've been talking about here, with regards to, not only resource protection, but also, creating the vibrant communities and meeting the needs of all the different citizens within that community?
Sure. I mean, I'll give a couple examples for Farmington, and how sort of we've utilized that, whether they know it or not, they have. So the first one, and we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, is the accessory dwelling units. A couple of years ago, they did not allow for detached accessory dwelling units. It was only attached only. And it was also something that was done by a conditional use permit with the planning board. And so administratively, an applicant had to go through the planning board process to get an ADU approved. And so one of the things that we did that was pretty low-hanging fruit was we just changed that, and we allowed ADUs to be allowed by right. We put it into the building permit process to make it a little easier for an applicant to, move forward with that. And then we also allowed for detached to be allowed by right as well. Now there's some ongoing discussions, whether or not what happens at the state level, and what changes may need to be made there. But there's also been some discussions as to whether or not, we wanted to require different potentially architectural standards in different areas of town. In the village district or the urban residential area, you might want an ADU to look a certain way, whereas maybe out in the ag district, you don't really care what it looks like, because those are lots are much bigger. So that's one example of what we've done. Adaptive reuse is something that we have really tried to accomplish. You see this, or you have seen this in a lot of the mill buildings. Dover, Rollinsford, Newmarket are good examples of those old mill buildings being reused and readapted for residential and commercial purposes. In Farmington, we've tried to redevelop the former fire station lot. We've run into some environmental challenges there. The existing municipal offices that we're in now, was an old school. It was built in the 1890s. It doesn't really serve as, the municipal, town offices anymore. We're starting to think about an adaptive reuse of that property, which may make great housing. And so thinking about that, where there's opportunities to do what we did in Farmington was we got a USDA grant for a community facilities grant, and we did an assessment of that building to kind of look at it. What are the opportunities? What would it take to bring that building up to code? And, it's an older building, so there are challenges with that. And so, that's something that adaptive reuse for that building for housing was another option that we've looked at. We've also revamped our 79E program to make the application easier. We're trying to promote it more. We're a pretty low standard in terms of what it takes to use that. We just use what the lowest bar for the state is, which is $75,000 or 15%, whatever that is. That substantial rehabilitation is what makes the program eligible. There are other communities that utilize a much higher standard, but Farmington uses the lowest one that's eligible to sort of encourage folks to make a reinvestment in some of the downtown buildings that just need to be redeveloped for additional units. The last one I'll mention is, I wouldn't go so far as to call it form-based code, because it's not. However, the village district and the urban residential district do provide some flexibility with the front setbacks that talk specifically about if a building or a series of buildings are in some uniform setback from the road, and the base setback is 25 feet. Someone could come in and just build to that same line as that existing streetscape, instead of being forced to go back 25 feet. So it keeps that area sort of in line with the other residential development or whatever development is there. And so those are the only two districts that it's allowed. Any other district, you've got to be back from whatever the front setback is. But that, I think, is a sort of unique way to allow for some additional flexibility on the regulatory side. That's not full blown, form-based code that is, can be very complex. This was just, hey, if a building or series of buildings are, this far off the street frontage, then just continue that to keep and maintain that look and feel. So those are a couple of examples of some of the things that are mentioned in the toolbox that Farmington has kind of implemented over the last couple of years.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Blair, I'm going to jump in real quick with a question that we have in the Q&A, and I'm going to send it to Emmy because it segues perfectly here from some of the things that Kyle has just shared. Liz from Somersworth put in the chat, how can we make it easier for small scale housing projects to be built, say 4 to 12 units?
Great question. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a combination of things to do that. And we're already seeing some really significant progress on those. But, it really falls into, I would say, 3 major categories. One is zoning reform, right? So, permitting multifamily in as many places as possible. Reducing parking requirements to make it more affordable for developers to build those units. And I always like to remind people that reducing or eliminating parking requirements does not mean forbidding parking. Developers can still choose to add parking if it makes sense for their development. So I think that, is a really effective strategy and lets the market kind of take care of how many parking spaces are needed. Of course, ADU bill legislation. We just saw a piece of legislation that's headed to the governor's desk that will allow for attached and detached ADUs by right. So that's really exciting. And then I would say the second category is really streamlining the permitting process as much as possible, because time is money and developers will lose a lot of money if developments take too long to get through the process. And so, looking at, how to streamline that as much as possible. I believe that there was a piece of legislation being considered this year that would allow developers to hire third-party engineers and inspectors to sort of expedite the approval and inspection process, knowing how municipalities are limited in their capacity and ability to get these projects permitted. And then finally, funding incentives. And unfortunately, the state budget is a little sad this year in terms of creating those incentives, but that's something that we need to continue to advocate for is incentives for those sorts of housing types through the affordable housing funds, through municipal grant programs, and all of those things. So I'd say those are the three major categories that I would focus on.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for the question. I am going to put it out to the group, a final question of, what is, anything that you want to highlight, bring to everyone's attention, something that didn't get mentioned or something that did get mentioned that you would like to speak to. But the idea of the housing toolkit and the options that people have, that communities have, it is it's more than just that type of regulatory changes. You have your processes, you have all of your setbacks. So there's a lot more to it than just putting in cottage courts, right? There's a lot of opportunities for people out there, and that's why I was trying to bring up the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox for people that want to see what the options are for your community. Not all of them fit your community, but they are all options. Abby, I'll let you go. Abigail, I'll let you go first if you want to jump in, and if you want to talk about the toolbox, or if you want to just highlight some interesting projects that you've seen out there.
Sure, I can highlight maybe a project and then a sort of concept or policy in a community. So, gosh, I can't remember the year now, but a few years ago, PREP supported the Strafford Regional Planning Commission to work with the city of Dover to look at increasing buffer protections along wetlands. So protection of natural resources, not fully to, permanent protection, land conservation. But it was a really unique project in that it asked the Conservation Commission and members of the committee to really think about what are those functions and values that they held dear. Now, full disclosure, I'm also a member of the Conservation Commission in Dover. And so I have a unique perspective on the project, not just as a funder, but as someone who got to see those conversations play out. Dover in particular is an urbanized community, but we do have resources, large tracts of wetlands that we would like to see, better protected, or have additional buffers to protect against those total suspended solids, the nutrient pollution, to protect wildlife corridors through our community, to connect conservation parcels, for example. And so there was a process to think through what are some functions and values that we really want to elevate or really highlight in our community, and using those as criteria to explore ways to increase buffer protections on certain properties or around certain wetland complexes, recognizing that we have kind of a smattering of different types of wetland resources in the community. Some are, rank higher in terms of function and values than others. So we wouldn't lose the buffer protection that we had in place, but it was a chance to sort of extend it in some places. That project stalled for other reasons, but it was really nice to see that conversation being had, bringing in community voices. What are those things that we value most? And I think it could translate really nicely to, conservation planning, and thinking about mapping out your community in terms of where you want to see development, where you want to see more protections. The other is another example from the city of Dover, and I might tap Kyle to chime in on this as well, but the policy is the transfer of development rights, which creates these opportunities where we can see denser development or those density bonuses in places maybe in cluster developments or thinking about infill developments, and setting aside open space. It also creates a really great mechanism for the city to take in funds to be able to support land conservation efforts in the community. And we saw with the introduction of transfer development rights, or TDR, as it's often referred to, we saw resources, liquid assets that the city could then use to purchase parcels within the community boundaries, to be able to permanently protect. And so it was kind of a nice way to both incentivize, less of this urban sprawl, as Emmy had mentioned, and this threat to water quality, threat to our natural resources, habitat fragmentation, but also to create an opportunity for us to permanently conserve certain parcels within the town.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Kyle, I'll send it over to you next. You were mentioned, I don't know if you want to add on to that, but you are familiar with their TDR program. If there's more to say on that, or just final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll sort of close the loop on the TDR, is that it is not perfect, and that, like most regulations, they need tweaking over time. Just because you set something, in motion now doesn't mean that that's going to work in perpetuity. Things change. Something, a regulation might have an unforeseen consequence, or, be leading to something else that you hadn't really thought of at the time of when drafting it. And so I would encourage all municipalities to take a look at their environmental overlay districts from time to time, whether that's their wetlands overlay or their shoreline protection or steep slopes or whatever it is, and do an audit on it, and to look to see if they're accomplishing what the intended purpose is. One other regulatory mechanism that has kind of come to, I would say, not popular, but it has certainly gained more political will over the last several years, has been a septic ordinance. Under, the state allows that under a health ordinance. And so communities are starting to look at that. New Durham adopted one, Northwood has a draft in front of them. Middleton is thinking about a septic ordinance. And so, there are a lot of, and it was mentioned earlier on, there are a lot of these smaller homes that were always seasonal, and post-COVID, they have sort of turned into 4-season homes that are expanded, and maybe there's an ADU on it. And so, having a mechanism like that may not have been a need 5 or 6 years ago, but it has become more of a need now. So I think that, in a very general sense, to make sure that you're sort of looking at your environmental regulations from time to time, and the Planning Commission can provide technical assistance and look and help to find grants to help you update those, or have someone, whether it's us or somebody else, to kind of look at and give you recommendations on the ways to strengthen them. So I would just sort of encourage folks to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid point about your overlay districts. It's easy to look at the base zoning and forget about a lot of those. And sometimes those overlay districts will run across 2 base districts, and you can end up with conflicts. And you don't find out about it until someone brings a project forward that's in that Venn diagram, overlay area, and you realize you've got yourself a bit of a problem that you need to address. So yeah, that's a really good point about looking at your overlay districts, and not just the environmental ones, all of the overlay districts, because yeah, they will all have an impact on the base district. Emmy, you get the final word here, and then we are going to open it up to questions for 10-15 minutes or so.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to touch on, which is actually outlined in the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, is cluster developments. So you can read more about them, and I think there are actually some case studies Their New Hampshire housing is great for case studies. So if you want to see how something is sort of being done in maybe not neighboring communities, but you know, in New Hampshire communities, definitely check out that toolbox. But essentially, the Workforce Housing Coalition, obviously, we work with a lot of rural communities who struggle with water and sewer. And so we, a couple of years ago, hosted a community discussion on housing approaches for municipalities with limited or no public water and sewer infrastructure. And one of the approaches that, you know, it's not easy. You know, candidly, it's much more difficult in those communities. But it is possible. And so one of the approaches that we kind of broke down was community septic systems and within cluster developments or in relation to cluster developments, which is really a great option for, you know, reducing infrastructure costs for the project and land costs for each unit, and can really lead to more affordable options. And so communities can look at actually creating cluster ordinances to allow for that kind of development. And it's really a win-win for in a lot of ways. So take a look at those case studies if you can. I can try to find them and link them in the chat. But I will also link kind of our final summary of that event for you to all look at, because there are some other approaches there for you to consider.
That's great. Thank you. I am, just before we go to questions, I wanted to toss it to Jen a little bit out of the blue. Emmy brought up cluster development. What we hear, or what I've seen in other communities, you have cluster development, you have open space development, you have conservation development. From an RSA perspective, is there a difference? If so, what is it?
No, so under enabling statute, they would all fall under RSA 674-21 as an innovative land use mechanism. It's ultimately, they all fall under one of the suggested items that are in there. It is a inclusive list, so you can pull in more things than are allowed under, or more things than are detailed or articulated under the statute. Ultimately, what it comes down to are what are your objectives with that ordinance? And so sometimes folks will use different titles for ultimately the same thing. Those titles will either be indicative of the objective or what might be more politically palatable to the voters. So.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that I see it a lot in different communities. They all allow the option, but there's a lot of different names for it. So if it's something for your community, just understand that you might find it under different names if you go poking around different people's zoning ordinances. So with that said, I do want to give everybody in the audience that took time to join us here today and give them a chance to ask us a question. So if you have something you want to put in the Q&A box, that's a great place to start.
Well, I'm apparently getting wild and crazy, and I clicked the allow to talk, which is bringing everyone in as panelists. So
Okay.
I'm allowing folks to talk. We have a vetted list of participants. Normally, we keep it, you know,
Right.
just to have the security in place.
So if you're out there, please jump in with a question.
Yeah. Kate, I see you just unmuted. Putting Kate on the spot.
All right. I hate to end it early, but I guess, you know, we can all save 5 minutes. Panelists, any final thoughts before we let you go?
Oh, Kate does not have a microphone.
Okay.
Sorry, Kate.
I guess, Blair, I would say, you know, just to wrap things up, is that and it's already been kind of said, but just to reinforce this, is that this is not a one size fits all. And that is, mostly the case with planning, is that you can't just pick one tool from one thing and like, this is going to solve this particular issue. It's not. And you have to sort of, it's way more nuanced than that. And you're going to have to sort of look at, different mechanisms. It could be a combination. Jen mentions political will. There might be something that voters, would support. There might be something that, they're absolutely, it's a non-starter, right? And so I think that, these were just some examples of how these types of things, sort of coalesce with each other. And what I will say is that there are a ton of resources out there, for communities to utilize. And if you don't know where to go, there are folks that, were part of this call, the Planning Commission. We can at the very least, try to guide you to the right, direction. And then the one other thing that I would mention, we talked about, this whole thing is under the umbrella of sort of rural character and preserving that in this, world of a housing need. And one thing that we sort of talked about as a group before this call was rural identity means very different things to different people, right? And that term has changed. While it's in every single master plan that I have ever seen in New Hampshire, what it means to people has changed over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. And so, what we have seen for development, in some of these areas, if it's in a sort of urban area, no one tends to really blink an eye. But when you start to see farms or open spaces that are being converted to larger housing developments, people tend to see that change in landscape, and it's very visceral. And so I think that, keeping that in mind and kind of getting a sort of thinking about the context of what rural identity really means in 2025. This is not the 60s. This is not the 70s. Rural identity is different now. And so, I think just thinking about that and how do we want to sort of capture that, maintain what makes New Hampshire so special, but also providing the opportunity for people to move here, and how do we kind of balance those two things at the same time? It is not impossible. It may seem difficult and like, how do we do this? But it's not impossible, and that there are plenty of examples of how communities are doing this.
Yeah, there's a lot of great case studies out there. Revisit past decisions of your planning board and board of appeals, and see how it looks, and begin to tweak. But yeah, I think that's what I was hoping to, what SRPC was hoping to bring forward today. There's a lot of options. You've got to have those community conversations. It's ongoing. The housing issues didn't arrive here overnight, so they're not going to be resolved overnight. It's going to take some time, but we've got to keep having the conversations with each other to move that forward. Emmy asked if this session is going to be recorded. Yes, it was recorded. It'll be posted to SRPC's YouTube channel at the very least. You might see a link on LinkedIn or Instagram, but at the very least, it'll be on the YouTube channel. Also, there was a lot of resources brought to everyone's attention from the panelists, Jen, that was put into the chat, and we'll compile that, and we have everyone's email that signed up for this event, and we'll send it out to you so you have it all in one place if you haven't been grabbing them as they've been posted. So I'll make sure to pull that together for everyone and get it out to you probably next week. But I do want to say thank you again to our panelists, to Emmy Ham of Seacoast Workforce Housing, and Abigail Lyon from PrEP, and of course Kyle Pimental from SRPC, and Jen for kicking us off in the beginning. So thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.